So Ryan, first of all, thank you for letting us play your game, That Dragon Cancer, at the festival at Greenbelt. We've really, I'm not sure if enjoyed is the right word, we've really appreciated playing through it. But I wanted to give you a chance to say, what would you say if you were here in person?
Um, well, I'd say that, I'd say thank you for letting me share our story and our testimony with you in this way. I think, or I hope that, what we've done here kind of shows you a way to share testimony in this form. And I think it's a unique form. I think video games are a unique form for sharing our story and sharing our experience, inviting people into our life. And and it may run counter to what you expect from a video game and interactive art. And so, in that regard, I'm hopeful that I'm hopeful that people from all disciplines will kind of add their voice into the interactive medium because I think it's a really powerful way to invite people into the worlds that we create in a different way than painting or poetry or film or novel or dance or any of those things. I think those are all art forms that are familiar to us as Christians and as creatives that want to imbue what we create with our worldview and with our spiritual experience. And so, I hope to see all of those kind of disciplines and all those ways of worship and expression to be incorporated into the interactive form. So,
And do you think That Dragon Cancer and the work you're doing is kind of the green shoots, sort of the first of many, or do you see yourself as sort of standing on the shoulders of other
well, yeah, I
creators?
mean, there have been for many years, Christian video games go back 30 years, and so there have been many forerunners in this space. And so, we're part of a larger community of Christian game developers. I just recently, last week, went to a Christian game developers conference in Oregon that's been going for the last decade. And so, I think as far as I'm concerned, it's more of an invitation to join what we're doing and to kind of um, discover the form, because there's so much left undiscovered, and there's new frontiers of expression and narrative and storytelling and that's being developed now, because video games as a form are only 30, 40 years old. So there's so much to be discovered.
And in terms of being a Christian who's making video games, how's that being received in the sort of the wider world, in terms of sort of critics and the general
Yeah.
reception for your game?
Well, I've been just overwhelmed by the culture at large's willingness to just listen to our story, even though we talk about faith and we talk about loss and we talk about eternal things. And so, yeah, I've been pleasantly um, both relieved and grateful that we weren't rejected because of that.
And it seems like it's potentially a bit of a risk, putting so much of your sort of self and your personal life in the game. Obviously, that's a risk that you weighed up. Were there any people sort of saying maybe you shouldn't be doing this, or how did that play out in your sort of your community?
um, I think Amy and I are oversharers by nature, and so ever since Joel got sick, we were always sharing everything that was happening. For us, we just wanted, to tell the story that was being written on us. And I think in that regard, it's not safe. In our experience, it's been good, and I think that there's been a lot of people that have come to our defense in that. I think there's like this initial, you know, when people hear video game, they like initially recoil at the aspect of that. And so I think the most feedback or the most pushback that we've gotten was because we chose to express this through a video game. And so in that regard, it's usually just a matter of showing people what we've done. And I think when people see what we've done, then they receive it.
And as we've explored it, different people have noticed very different things in the game, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly like items that run through the game, like the boat seems to be a sort of a motif that
Yeah.
appears throughout. Could you talk a bit about that, and maybe if there's other things which you might have missed that you could highlight, that would be really interesting.
Yeah. Amy and I grew up in a fairly charismatic American, an American charismatic context, and the Word of Faith movement and prosperity gospel and some of those things, and I think some of the things that go along with that are faith healing and just the belief that God still works today in supernatural gifts. And so we still believe that, but I think we also kind of start to merge with our Reformed brothers and sisters that may who still may believe those things, but maybe not in the prominence that our tradition does. And so I think there's like this idea that if you do things certain ways, there becomes kind of this prescriptive theology of like, if you do things or pray things certain ways, then this is how you get something out of God. And so this is the boat is kind of a reflection of like, well, how much do we really, how much free will, how much influence do we really have? Like there's this river of God's will, and you have these banks, and can we, are we able to row in between those banks, or are we taken downstream against our will? Or, can we swim upstream? Can we change the direction of the river? I think all of those things, when we come up against, when theology is put into practice, when the things that we've learned and the things that we've been taught through Scripture are then applied to our life and how that plays out, and then wrestling with that disconnect, I think is a lot of what our game is about, is that expectation of supernatural healing, and then what happens when that expectation is doesn't happen, is not fulfilled. And then what are you left with? Is the theology wrong? Is the way we see God wrong? Is it really even about faith working, or like our prescriptive theologies working, or is it about like the place that we rest in the midst of those questions? In the midst of that uncertainty, what do we do with uncertainty? So yeah, like I feel like the boat motif is like this idea of like, are we rowing? And there's this point in the game where Amy and I are having an argument, and I say like, you don't even have any oars, and you're so sure you're just going to get there, And I think there's that frustration of like that certainty that like, if we do this, then God will do this, and and it's like that frustration of like, how can you have so much rest? How can you have so much trust? I'm drowning out here. And yet I think even in the middle of those experiences where like our faith doesn't match, or our experience doesn't match our theology, I still think that even in the mystery of that and trying to wrestle with that, there's still a posture that we can take. And that posture is Sabbath. That posture is rest. That posture is like that, Jesus is our rest. And so that hope that remains is the thing that we float on, it's our foundation. So yeah, there's many things swirling in that motif, but a lot of times there's just like the will of God kind of taking us downstream. And what is our posture in the midst of that?
And in the game, you connect that to the parable of Jesus and the disciples crossing the lake in the boat, and he's asleep.
Yeah.
I mean, from what you said already, I can see the connections. But that was obviously an intentional choice of which parable you include. And then, as a gamer, that was quite shocking when you actually say the word Jesus, and when you then use a specific parable. I wasn't expecting you, even knowing you, I wasn't expecting you to be so overt in that. And so that seemed like an interesting moment.
In that specific example, Jesus made a promise: we're going to the other side. And I think when Jesus said, you're going to the other side, and in the midst of all the turmoil and storm, we're shouting, why have you left us? Why have you forsaken us? That's kind of a microcosm of our life, of just like, for one, defining what the other side is. Like when Jesus says, we're going to the other side of the lake, if we were to apply that in a greater spiritual sense, what has he promised us, And in the midst of that, what do we have to go? We have to go through that water. We have to go maybe through death. We have to go through suffering. We have to go through all of those things, but the promise is that we'll go to the other side. And so I think even the disciples, like, it's funny, the disciples flail and they yell, and he's frustrated with them, but he still calms the sea. Like, he still calms. He didn't have to. He could have let them kept thrashing in the storm, and eventually they would have gotten to the other end. But I think sometimes Christ shows us mercy. He has compassion on us, and I think that we're often caught in life between the storm and the calm, and even in the game, Amy and I are left in the middle of the sea. Like this lighthouse is kind of this person. It's like the only kind of Christ figure in the game. It's just this lighthouse and this foundation, and we can rest on this foundation. But we're still not to the other side yet.
As you're talking, and it's quite apparent. Anyone who knows the game and the conclusion of the story, you set out to make a game about Joel, and we've talked before, and you've said how the story didn't end how you maybe thought or hoped it would.
The thing is that that boat is kind of God's grace, and I think in the middle of the game you see the boat kind of following the dove. You're kind of flying around as the dove, and the boat kind of follows the dove, and so in that way, like, you just kind of follow grace, and the direction is kind of out of our control. But then there's this rest at the lighthouse, and then the boat, you'll notice, kind of like it doesn't really sink, but it docks in the cathedral. Mm-hmm. And so Amy and I leave the boat at the cathedral. That's where the veil is, like that's between the temporal and the eternal. And what, where you last see the boat is on the way to the shores of the park at the edge of the world, and it's kind of an allusion to Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where they're taking the boat to the edge, and going up into Narnia. So there's this it's meant to convey kind of the hope that we have. Like when you start the game, you kind of see the boat, and it's at that park. And then this whole cycle of leaving the park and going through this experience with Joel's life, and Joel's life returning to the park, it's meant to just kind of convey how God's grace kind of carries us through all of that. And so yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but I think, the idea is that Joel is the last one to see the boat, and the boat will come for us too, eventually.
So I've got two questions just to finish off with. So firstly, through the InterACT sessions at Greenbelt, we're encouraging people to engage in a fresh way in video games, to ask what they're about rather than just being entertainment. Have you got any advice for people here today who maybe don't play games that often? How would you suggest that they go about getting more from the games they play?
I guess my first suggestion would be look for moments of grace in the video games that you play. And what I mean by that is look for moments when you couldn't have overcome an obstacle in the game without the designer's help. And I think that when we start looking at games that way, we can look at our lives in the way of like our relationship to the designer. Like C.S. Lewis calls us small, like lowercase c creators, right? We're not like the proper noun creator, but we are like a reflection, and we have our mini creations. And I think video games are kind of like our shadows of creation, and they reflect a certain aspect of the creator. And so I think when we look for those names of God, when we look for those expressions of what God is like, when we look for those treasures that we find in the kingdom of God, and we see those shadowed in things like video games, I think they can present a mirror to our lives, and allow us to kind of examine how we parse all of that. So
that's great. Now, I know a lot of people will be wanting to make a purchase of That Dragon Cancer and be taking it home and introducing it to friends and family and churches. So beyond actually sort of buying the game, and people wanted to support the work that you're doing particularly, is there a way they can connect with you or something you would point them to?
Yeah, our website, thatdragoncancer.com, has a way to purchase the game and also a way to donate to our studio. Numinous Games is a group of, I think there's 7 of us right now, representing multiple families, and so we're able to continue to work and continue to create because people support us. So yeah, we appreciate any support that they're willing to give.
Great. Well, thanks for being our sort of virtual guest at Greenbelt this year, and thank you again for being very generous with sharing your game with us over the festival. And perhaps we'll get you to come over in person at some point in future years, because I think you'd like it here.
I'd love that.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.